1 minute past 7, so I'm going to make a start. So firstly, I just want to welcome everyone to the General Federation of Trade Unions Educational Trust and Working Class History series in partnership with the March Memorial Library and Working Class Movement Library. My name is Claudia Webb, and I am a trustee of the March Memorial Library. Tonight's session is on the Chainmakers, 1910, with Cathy Hunt. So this is how the event will work. This event is a Zoom seminar. You can see us, but we cannot see you, and you cannot see each other. After Cathy's presentation, we will take questions which you can ask anytime using the screen, rather using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I will then read out your questions to Cathy. We want to also remind you at this time that during the call, we will be following the GFTU Educational Trust Behaviour Statement, which the link for that is in the chat, and it's in the chat now. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Cathy is an independent historian with a special interest in women workers and activists in the early 20th century British labour movement. She has written a biography of the trade union leader, Mary MacArthur, and a history of the union she founded in 1906, the National Federation of Women Workers. So over to you, Cathy.
Thank you. Thanks, Claudia. Hello, good evening, everybody. Right, the first thing I'm going to do is just share my screen so that you have some good slides to look at and don't have to stare at me for the duration. So just bear with me. I practiced it with Ben. It should work. I will rely on somebody to tell me in a minute whether it has. Are we good?
We're good.
We're good. Okay. All right. So the Chainmakers strike of 1910. A 10-week strike took place in the late summer and autumn 1910 in Cradley Heath in the Black Country in the West Midlands. And like the general strike in 1842, which kicked off this series, and the match women's strike of 1888, this was a landmark event in British trade union and labour history, and one that, like the earlier ones, has continued to have even increased relevance in the current context of precarious contracts and poor working conditions. The first thing to say about this strike is that it succeeded. The minimum rates that the women received increased their wages in some cases from just 5 shillings a week to 11 shillings. And as importantly, it was a robust challenge to employers who thought they could get away with paying less to people they thought were unimportant and unobserved by the world. The minimum rates that had been given had been set out in the Trade Boards Act of 1909, the year before the strike. But the majority of employers in the chain-making industry sought ways to get around this. And they really thought they could get away with it. Surely they could handle a bunch of women workers. Surely they'd be grateful for work at any price. But it turned out that as a result of the women's 10-week strike, the employers were shamed and then defeated. The Chainmakers' action in 1910 became in effect a test case for making sure that minimum wage rates set by the Trade Boards Act were actually paid. This act, the Trade Boards Act, was one of a series passed by the Liberal government which came to power in 1906. In the pre-First World War years, this government introduced a number of reforms relating to working class people. Reforms intended to tackle poverty, which included the Old Age Pension Act, the National Insurance Act, which gave health benefits to workers, unemployment benefit to some. There was also the Trade Disputes Act of 1906, which reversed the earlier legislation, the 1901 Taff Vale judgment, which had severely weakened the ability of trade unions to take strike action because it had made trade unions liable for damages to employers during strikes. And this new 1906 Act ensured that trade unions had the legal right to strike and would no longer be held liable by their employers for costs incurred. The success of the Chainmakers strike is of enormous consequence to workers. If this strike had failed, it would have been harder still for those low-paid workers in other trades covered by this and by subsequent trade boards to make sure they were paid the rate agreed by the boards. In fact, it's probably fair to say that if this strike had failed, so would the Trade Boards Act. As it was, more low-paying industries were covered by the trade boards. There were 35 industries covered by 1921. Trade boards were replaced by wages councils in 1945 and abolished by the Tories between 1986 and 1993. In 1999, it was a Labour government that introduced the national minimum wage. And there were arguments then, like those among the chainmaker employers in 1909, that this would cripple the economy. Others believed, as they also did in 1909, that the rate was set too low. The reality is that a minimum wage has raised the wages of millions of workers, and many employers since the chainmakers have been called out or fined for non-compliance. And as this government prepares to begin consultations on reforms to workers' rights, including unfair dismissal, 0 hours contracts, fair pay, fire and rehire practices, the Chainmakers strike stands as a reminder of the strength of the union among workers on the lowest of pay, so often those largely hidden, doing work no one really thinks about, it just gets done. The chainmakers were also among workers that the mainstream male-dominated labour movement at the time thought were too difficult to be organised, work that was considered to be too time-consuming, too costly to take on, because of the uncertainty that membership would be sustained. I'll come back to these issues shortly. So my introduction to the Chainmakers strike came when I was researching the union that brought the women out and supported them. And this was the extraordinary experiment that was the National Federation of Women Workers, founded in 1906, specifically for low-paid women workers who were excluded either by sex or by trade from any other trade union. And the story of this union runs alongside that of the chainmakers of Cradley Heath. I also got to know much more about the woman who founded this union, was its general secretary, and who led the Chainmakers strike, Mary MacArthur. And I just want to say that while I'll talk quite a lot about her this evening, this isn't because I think the leadership of the strike was more important than the strikers themselves, but because her position within the trade union movement provides important context of women's trade unionism in the early 20th century when this strike took place. A good visual starting place to this talk is this building, the Workers' Institute, which is now located after a fundraising appeal at the Black Country Living Museum near Dudley in the West Midlands. This beautiful arts and crafts style building opened in Cradley Heath, which was at the heart of the strike. It opened in 1912, and it was built with money left over from the 10-week Chainmakers strike. And it's worth noting here that strike pay went to union and non-union members alike. I mean, that's pretty impressive before we get any further even. And this building was intended for use by working people, and it was an important meeting place. Here, workers could see a union official, they could pay their national insurance stamp, they could collect sickness or maternity, unemployment benefits, as well as attending socials, educational events, and even later the cinema. This was particularly important to isolated women workers, and women chain makers, as we'll see, worked in forges at the backs of their houses. Here they could keep in touch, not just with the union, but with each other. Meeting places for women at this time were difficult to come by for union women, because at that time the male-dominated pub or club was not really an accepted or realistic option for many women, even if they did have time for it between work and their domestic duties. And as the funds were coming in for the reconstruction of the Workers' Institute, the first Chainmakers Festival was held at the Black Country Living Museum. And this has since become an annual event, now held by the Midlands TUC in Mary MacArthur Park in Cradley Heath. Each year at the festival, there's a reconstruction of one of the many marches around Cradley Heath that happened during the strike, and it ends with one of MacArthur's strike speeches. To get into the park for the festival, you pass by these evocative statues of chainmakers by local sculptor Luke Perry, who himself had chainmakers in his family. And it's clear that there's enormous local pride in the festival and in the strike. Chainmaking was a big industry here. The Black Country, and specifically the area around Cradley Heath, was the centre of the chainmaking industry. All sizes of chain for all sorts of purposes. And I would say that there's no doubt that earlier than our period, but some of the chain used in the transatlantic slave trade would have come from this region. By the beginning of the 20th century, you've got large chains, such as those for ships' anchors, were made by men in factories. Lighter chains, the so-called hand-hammered section of the industry, were typically made by women who, as I said, had forges in outhouses at the backs of their houses. Maybe these chains were used in the early 20th century in agricultural settings, either to tether animals on gates in factories. But lots of local people had family within living memory, men and women, who made chain. And the bravery of the women who came out in 1910 is rightly remembered and applauded in this region. So this evening, excuse me, I will of course talk about the causes of the strike and the course of the strike, but I want to start by putting things in context by taking a closer look at women's work, including sweated labour, and women's trade unionism in the earlier 20th century to set the scene. Mary MacArthur makes a good starting place because her work runs through the whole period. She's also a trade union leader who I think deserves to be far better known within the labour movement, and quite possibly would have been had she not died so young, aged just 40, in 1921. She was born into a relatively affluent family in Glasgow. Her conversion to trade unionism while working at her father's drapery as a bookkeeper was through the Shop Assistants Union in the opening years of the 20th century. Certainly this was a surprise for her conservative family, who were even more surprised when this charismatic, ambitious young woman of just 23 moved to London and took up the paid position as secretary of the Women's Trade Union League. Now, the Women's Trade Union League was almost 30 years old by the time Mary MacArthur joined it. Its focus was now more militant than it had been at the time, say, when the Matchwomen's strike took place. And now, in 1903, whilst encouraging and supporting women's trade unionism around the country, it also offered affiliation to small unions. It was still led by middle-class women, which is why I stress that Mary MacArthur, her position was paid. She did this as her job. And the League did also employ a small team of working-class women organisers who gave advice and support where and when it was requested, particularly amongst women who found themselves excluded from all male unions, with no other union to go to. In such circumstances, the only alternative was to help women band together, create their own small societies, which could then affiliate to the Women's Trade Union League. And by 1903, when MacArthur joined, there were about 48 such trade unions affiliated. The League also lobbied for parliamentary legislation that would protect the most vulnerable of women industrial workers, followed up by campaigns. There was, for example, in the Staffordshire potteries, a campaign aimed at raising public awareness of the dangers of lead in glaze, exacerbated by dust in poorly ventilated workshops. And so the Women's Trade Union League worked closely with the new women factory inspectors to ensure that employers didn't evade the law. Of those small unions or societies affiliated to the League, some were very small indeed. The names show how small, such as the Pimlico Tailoresses, the Liverpool Upholsteresses, the London Cigarette Makers. And the existence of such small societies was always precarious. Strike funds, if they existed at all, were minimal. And there were always too few League organisers to be able to maintain the regular contact needed to allow the unions to put down roots and grow. In 1896, there were just over 1.5 million trade union members in Britain, of which just about 7% were women. I think that's around 120,000 women. Of these women, the largest number worked in the cotton industry of the Northwest, where trade union membership of men and women was fairly commonplace and where women's wages were higher than in any other form of industrial work. But in the so-called women's trades, laundry work, garment working, food production, packing, cardboard box, paper bag making, and of course, chain making, there'd been very few moves from within the labour movement to encourage women to join unions. It was too widely assumed that women made poor trade union members, unwilling to attend meetings, reluctant to pay their subscription fees, unable to stand firm with their brothers when requested to do so. Taking women collectively, wrote Will Thorne, leader of the gas workers and general labourers, women do not seem to grasp the real need for unions. But at the Women's Trade Union League, Mary MacArthur focused much of her attention on these so-called difficult to organise women. And among these women were the very hidden home workers, producing goods at speed, repetitive work done under great pressure, paid by the piece, often involving the whole family to get the work done on time. But whether at home, in workshops, or in factories, these were women whose wages were scandalously low, who worked excessive hours and in poor conditions. One of Mary MacArthur's favourite sayings was that women are badly paid and badly treated because they are not organised, and they are not organised because they are badly paid and badly treated. And this pretty well summed up a great deal of women's labour at the start of the 20th century. There were societal assumptions that working class women had short working lives between school and getting married. Now, for however long women were in employment, their wages were less than men's. That assumption that they were young, single, and still living with their families helped to keep their wages low. Employers imagined that these girls could live much more cheaply than men. They didn't need to eat as much, they needed less. Men, on the other hand, were paid a higher so-called family wage because it was assumed they had dependents. The idea that women workers only worked before marriage was, of course, completely wrong. In a society largely without safety nets, women workers were young, they were old, they were married, they were single parents, they were disabled, they were widowed, and they too, of course, had dependents to support. And in addition, these women, like the shop assistants that Mary MacArthur had organised among in Scotland, were subject to no end of petty fines and pay deductions, which kept their wages even lower. Fines for spoilt goods, for going to the loo on work's time, for singing, for dancing. And employers, as I said earlier, reckoned they could treat women like this. For women were surely docile and obedient. And if they did raise their voices in objection, well, they were left in no doubt that someone else would take their place, and then they'd be without income and saddled locally with a reputation as a troublemaker. In 1906, then, Mary MacArthur, from within the Women's Trade Union League, founded the National Federation of Women Workers to organise women for whom there was no obvious trade union into one large all-female trade union for women working in a range of industries. The idea was that the Federation would develop a network of branches across the country, and that it would also bring in those small, struggling societies, and that new ones too would become branches of the Federation. And that is what happened to the chainmaking union that the Women's Trade Union League had already helped to establish in Cradley Heath, and which in turn became a branch of the National Federation of Women Workers. So the Federation itself operated under the umbrella of the Women's Trade Union League. The Federation then affiliated to the General Federation of Trade Unions as insurance in cases of lengthy and expensive industrial action, so that member benefits, including strike pay, could be paid. Even this, however, was limited, of course, as we'll see. The success of the Chainmakers strike meant also raising money through public appeals. But by the end of its first year, in 1906, the National Federation of Women Workers had just a handful of branches from Scotland to London. By 1914, there were over 10,000 members with branches across the country. By the end of the First World War, it had about 80,000 members, which included some pretty hefty branches among women munitions workers. This was never a big union by any means, but it punched above its weight through some high-profile disputes. And Mary MacArthur, as we'll see, certainly had an eye for publicity. As an example of the sort of publicity that she ran, these postcards that belong to the TUC library were printed in 1908 to help with funds during a strike in London at the Corriganza box-making factory. You can see here postcards that captured the strikers walking to the station, marching to Trafalgar Square. You can see Mary MacArthur there on the platform for what was a very well publicised event attended by the press. And I think you can see members of the press actually on the plinth there on, it might be that I'm in front of it, I can't see, but anyway, this is the sort of publicity that was beginning to be run by the Federation. Mary MacArthur was also one of several activists campaigning to highlight the problem of sweated labour in Britain and to eradicate it. Sweated labour had been broadly defined in the late 1880s when a House of Lords committee looked at the problem for the not sure if it's for the first time. Low pay, poor working conditions and very long working hours. Mary MacArthur insisted that even this term, sweating, was inadequate to use when describing the worst conditions that many women worked in, and she used her own term, the super sweated, to describe those in the very worst positions and therefore in need of the most urgent reform. And so in 1906, there was an exhibition at the Queen's Hall in Langham Place where the public could go to observe workers from 45 sweated trades, including chain making, going about their daily employment in stalls constructed to resemble home working conditions. Although it was dismissed by some as nothing more than a stunt, it was a pretty bold idea, and it did create a powerful visual experience. And it is galling to think of well-off people paying an entrance fee to go and gawp at the poor, but it does seem to have had something of an impact. The Women's Trade Union Review reported that people learned, numbers among them evidently for the first time in their lives, on what kind of foundation much of the industrialism of this country was resting. They drew near, half appalled, half fascinated, and saw and heard for themselves. They listened to the lectures that were given day after day by men and women who knew all that lay behind the work exhibited on the stalls. Here, and at subsequent exhibitions held in other British cities, visitors watched as workers made all sorts of clothing, like babies' bonnets, umbrellas, artificial flowers. They saw shawls being fringed. These were luxury goods. Now they were seeing how they were being made, shoes being beaded, lace being scalloped, books being folded. And visitors saw that far from the work being done by unskilled workers, much of it was in fact very highly skilled work, was carried out by men and women who'd perfected their abilities over years in order to turn out work as quickly and effectively as they could in order to feed themselves and their families. After the exhibition, combined efforts and much work through a campaigning anti-sweating league that was formed to put renewed pressure on the Liberal government that just might listen, resulted in the setting up of a select committee on homework. And it was within homework that the worst abuses were reckoned to occur, where workers, like the women chainmakers, were subject to the worst exploitation and intimidation because they were isolated, either collecting or having delivered to their door the materials to produce the work to be paid at piece rates, meaning always working at breakneck speed. The Select Committee's final report recommended the establishment of trade boards to safeguard the payment of legally enforceable minimum wages. And when this became law in October 1909, 4 of the worst paying sweated industries were selected as test cases. The boards, which were made up of representatives of employers, workers, and state-nominated independent persons, were established in paper box making, wholesale and bespoke tailoring, machine-made lace finishing, and chain making. The first to begin work on agreeing a minimum wage was in the hand-hammered section of the chain making board, largely the homework done by women. And what the chainmakers' experience shows most of all is the lengths that employers would go to in order to keep their labour costs as low as possible. Now, Mary MacArthur was part of that chainmakers' trade board. In May 1910, after 3 months of negotiations, the trade board finally agreed upon a rate, 2.5 pence per hour. And this fell quite a lot short of what Mary MacArthur had hoped for. A pragmatist, I'd say, she accepted it with reluctance as a basis for future improvement, but also in the knowledge that even this would raise hundreds of women's weekly wages by as much as up to 70, even 100%. Within the campaign to end sweating, there'd always been differences of opinion over setting minimum rates of pay. There were those like Ramsay and Margaret MacDonald, for example, who feared always that setting a minimum wage would depress wages at those levels for all time. Whereas others, and I think this was the camp that MacArthur was in, felt that a minimum wage was a starting point. And more than that, it might at the least remove the utter desperation that led so many workers to conclude that it would be easier to starve without the work than to starve with it. And that crucially, if legislation was accompanied by a drive to organise workers into trade unions, their position would be strengthened. So in the chain-making industry, women's wages, as I said at the start, were as low as 4 to 6 shillings a week for a 50 to 58-hour week. Under the new rates, this would raise that to between 10 to 11 shillings for a 55-hour week. It's always hard to talk comparisons, but just as a very crude one, the Board of Trade reckoned a male labourer's average wage in Britain at this time was about 25 shillings. So it's still a very low rate, but the rate was set. However, first, there was a 3-month period before the agreement was enforceable. Then there was a 6-month period in which workers could contract out of the new rates. Now, implausible though that sounds, that any worker would agree to this, the nature of this sweated homework made it easy for employers. They came up with a form so that women could sign their agreement to work at the lower rates. And many women did so, unsure of the right way to proceed or of what they were being presented with, being told by the middlemen who delivered materials to the women in their homes that this was the only way that future work could be guaranteed. By no means all the women who signed could read or write with ease, and they were easily taken advantage of. Because, this wasn't like a form going around a factory. This was taken from doorstep to doorstep, and individual women were being left in no doubt that if they didn't take the work offered at that rate, there were others who would. The majority of the employers were hoping that if they paid the workers at the old rates and at the same time stockpiled as much chain as they could, creating a market glut, they could then lay workers off and claim that the Trade Board Act had caused widespread unemployment. They'd reckoned, however, without the women and the union. They had certainly not expected nationwide publicity. In August, the National Federation of Women Workers drew up an agreement demanding the new rates be paid immediately. Women who refused to work for the lower rates were locked out. I mean, it wasn't technically a lockout because they worked in their own homes, but this was how it was called at the time. They were locked out by employers who then refused to deliver the materials that they needed to make chain. And so the National Federation called out the women and began a strike for the minimum rate. In response to that strike call, hundreds of Cradley Heath women either cancelled the contracts they'd signed agreeing to work at the lower rates, or they refused to sign at all. Now, not all the women were union members, and from the start, Mary knew that if the strike was to have any chance of success, there had to be strong support for everyone who was affected. A great deal of vital groundwork was superbly done by National Federation of Women Workers organisers, such as Julia Varley, another great trade unionist at this time. She'd worked here as part of the Women's Trade Union League. She was based locally, well, in Birmingham. She and others ensured that the women strikers were kept fully informed, that new members were enrolled as swiftly as possible, and most of all, that they fought together with all the resolve that they could muster. And these were organisers. Another was Charles Sitch, Cradley Heath born, from a trade union family background, organisers who understood the industry and crucially had good understanding of the women's lives. Strike pay of 5 shillings was available to union members by late August. But the National Federation of Women Workers funds weren't enough to sustain an indefinite strike. Moral support, pep talks were all well and good, but without financial assistance, the workers would be easily defeated. The only way that the Federation could hope to keep all the women out was to appeal to the public. And so a campaign to raise money was masterminded by Mary MacArthur. She worked the press so effectively that very few people in Britain remained in ignorance about the women's plight. She made sure that the situation was widely regarded not simply as a labour dispute, but as something of a humanitarian crisis. And this helped to bring in money from people who possibly would not have dreamt of supporting anything that might have been exploited by some upstart militant trade union. The public was incensed to learn that the wages owed to the women were theirs by right, and the attempts made to bully them out of it were met with righteous indignation. As the strike went on, the adverse publicity for the chain-making industry became extremely painful for many of the employers. Those within the Employers Association, the Chain Manufacturers Association, began to look for possible solutions to the strike. But at the same time, they tried to find ways to ensure that those employers and middlemen outside the association were not in the future going to undercut its members. In other words, it was perhaps more concerned with its members' profits than with the necessity of paying the women the correct rate. In early September, although the association had decided to concede the new rates, the Trade Board Acts, it asked the National Federation of Women Workers to guarantee strike pay to all women, union members or not. The Employers Association drew up an official white list of employers who agreed to pay the legal rate and to therefore not undercut its employer members. In other words, the actions of the Employers Association was not entirely altruistic. By looking to the union to sustain those women still out on strike, they hoped to eradicate practices that actually damaged their own profits. However, the union rose to the challenge to keep the women out on strike. And money started pouring in from rich and poor in response, as I said, to emotive press appeals. A Pathé newsreel film was made. I mean, this was truly a stroke of genius. Employers of local standing really did not wish to see themselves depicted in such a cruel light. There were brilliantly staged collections, as you can see here. Chained women stood on platforms, including at the TUC conference in Sheffield. They went to football grounds, standing on the pitch before and after games with bed sheets tied together so that the crowd could throw money onto them. One union official recalled that the collection was so heavy after a match in Coventry, and Coventry's well outside the Black Country with no connection with the chain-making industry. So it just shows how talk of the strike had spread. This collection was so heavy that the women officials had to take a taxi back to their union offices with all this money. Local traders gave what they could. In mid-September, a Wolverhampton baker made sure that each woman was given a 1 kilo loaf when she came to collect her strike pay. And overall, enough money was raised to give strike pay to union and non-union members alike. One journalist noting that this actually made many of the women better off than when they'd been working. And there's Mary. And whenever she arrived in Cradley Heath, either coming up from London or on a flying visit from union business elsewhere in the country, she was greeted with great receptions like these. In early September, a reporter watched a welcoming party at the railway station. The women, quote, all in their best and spruced up for the reception of the idolised Mary MacArthur. Processions were accompanied by a band, and the women danced to the band music with a jollity which made one feel more inclined to cry than to laugh. That's the reporter anyway. But the sense of theatre was an important feature of the dispute, and Mary MacArthur knew by now how to make the very most of it. She reminded Cradley Heath that the eyes of the world were on their strike, that down in London people were working day and night, responding to letters of support that were coming in from all parts of the country. And I know this is going to be too small to see, but I'll read out a little bit of it. It's a text of a letter written from the Women's Trade Union League seeking funds. We earnestly appeal to trade unionists throughout the country on behalf of the women chainmakers at Cradley Heath, now locked out for refusing to sign an agreement to work for 6 months at lower rates than the minimum fixed by the Trade Board. And then it goes on to say, despite the low earnings of these women, a number of them are members of the National Federation of Women Workers. It is, however, absolutely necessary that some measures of support should be extended to those who up to now are not members of any organisation. Some 200 of these women have up to now stood by their fellow workers in resisting the agreement. And then it goes on to say a fund has been opened in which we trust your society. This was sent to trade unions, but there were so many different letters sent to so many organisations, and people were sending in whatever money they could. There was £100 from the Countess of Beauchamp, and the Women's Trade Union League could usually be relied on to tap up a few pretty affluent folk. But at the other end of the scale, there was the twopence in postage stamps sent from a workman who said he wished he could send money, but he had no spare cash to send, so he sent stamps. J.J. Mallon of the Anti-Sweating League may have been right when he wrote that, as for Mary MacArthur, she had the time of her life, leading processions of chainmakers who followed her uphill and down dale. And to an extent, this was so. For women completely unused to publicity and attention, the arrival of an inspiring and striking-looking figurehead in their town was well worth cheering. But Mallon didn't imply that MacArthur didn't understand the strike or take it seriously. She worked that strike. She stood up for the women chainmakers, but she didn't eclipse them. Her tactics, her presence, her popularity in the area were important to the strike. I mean, even 8 years after the strike, she was still well known enough, well loved enough in the Black Country to be assured of a great deal of support when she was adopted as the Labour Party's parliamentary candidate in the first general election after the First World War. And additionally, I don't think the women dressed up for Mary MacArthur. There were many disputes in the years before the First World War, years often described as the Great Unrest. On marches and on platforms, women put on their best clothes, or they borrowed one another's, showing their strength and the dignity of their womanhood. And despite the words of pity heard across the country for the chainmakers because of the emotive aspect of the publicity, these were women who wanted to emphasise their unity and their defiance to the bosses who'd been so used to pushing them around. And I just found this photograph the other day, and it's not Chainmakers, but I always remember showing this photo It was taken at the end of a strike at a clothing factory in Coventry in 1914. And I remember somebody looking at that photo and saying to me, well, the women's wages can't have been that low then if they could afford to dress like this. But as I've said, you know, they pulled resources, they borrowed, they dressed up because it was important, because these were such important victories to women workers. Sorry, I'll go back to this one for a moment, just to show the strike of the Chainmakers officially ended on the 22nd of October, when the last employer signed up to what the employers had called the whitelist to pay the legal rate. The minimum rate was secured, and it was a terrific victory. And the strike really does deserve a prominent place in labour history. There were, of course, still struggles ahead. Membership of the union increased after the strike. The branch in Cradley Heath grew, but because of the nature of the home working part of the industry, it was always a battle to maintain membership levels in that branch and in branches across the country in different industries in the years ahead. The organisers of the National Federation of Women Workers worked so hard across the country to keep branches going after strikes. They faced challenges that included, you know, it wasn't that women didn't want to pay their union subscriptions. They had to think about what they could afford to pay. They had to think about keeping, the union had to retain its branch officials in the face of employer intimidation. And there was the constant pressure of being an isolated woman worker. This still has a resonance today, and unions still have to embrace the challenges of reaching the most hidden of workers. So women's trade unionism increased in the years before the First World War, and their numbers leapt significantly during the First World War, but that's another story. So hopefully I've been able to convey a little of how much a landmark strike this was. I would just say that if you want to know more about the strike, there's considerable trade union expertise about the strike. The document on, well, it's on my left, Women Chainmakers Beat Anvil or Hammer, that is an online union resource which is really detailed about the strike. And then on the other side is, this was a exhibition still online at the TUC to commemorate Mary McCarthy, 100 years since Mary MacArthur's death in this was in 1921, and this was done a few years ago. And you know, if you want to know some more about either the Federation or Mary MacArthur, there are these two books which are mine. So there we go. That's it. So I'll come off those because that's, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. I will stop sharing and come back. There we go.
Fantastic. Both fabulous and fantastic. Thank you. A big thank you to Cathy.